All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Historical Literate with Josh Kitchens, your 1 o'clock session. Uh, John and I are going to be monitoring the chat and Q&A. So if you have questions, please drop them in there in one of those two places, and we'll make sure Josh addresses them at the end of his presentation. Take it away, Josh.
All right, thank you, Nicole. I'm glad to be here. A couple of quick things before I jump in and kind of go over my sort of plans for our next hour. Is first, let me introduce myself. I'm Josh Kitchens. I'm the Director of Archival Services and Digital Initiatives at Georgia Public Library Services. I work with our 60 library systems in the state, 409 different library branches on thinking about how they can engage with their local history, their genealogical collections, as well as help them make those collections available online. Today, I kind of have a few goals that I'm hoping we can get out of this. First and foremost, one goal I always have anytime I do a presentation is I like to start a really great dialogue. And so I'm hoping we'll have plenty of time at the end where we can ask questions, but also share some of the different approaches that we have all done, whether you be in a public library setting, an academic setting, or K through 12 setting, about how to engage a variety of different types of users with historical materials, specifically on how they can kind of improve their literacy and their understanding of themselves and just the world in general. Uh, Two, I also kind of wanted to make everybody aware of the really great collections that our public libraries in the state have, as well as where you can find them specifically online through the DLG and use them in a variety of different projects that you might can come up with. So there's a lot out there and a lot of different opportunities for working with the historic collections, with the genealogy collections, with the archival collections that our public library has. And so I'm really just hoping to make everybody more aware of them. So typically, I like to share a slight agenda with everybody, kind of what I want to do. So I've kind of given you my goals, but I want to say specifically what we're going to talk about. So first and foremost, I just want to make everybody aware of the public library collections that are available, kind of go over some numbers, talk about kind of how they represent the different parts of our state, uh, as well as talk a little bit about how users have become engaged with public library materials, specifically some of the user interest in it, and kind of to help us sort of see where there is a possibility to engage with some literacy activities with these users because they do seem to have a deep interest in the various historical materials that are available to them. And then last but certainly not least, I want to talk about a few different forms of literacy. And actually, we'll do some audience participation at this point. We're going to go through just a few different forms of literacy that I think are really important when we talk about historical or archival collections. While this isn't all-encompassing, you can go into many different forms of literacy when you talk about archival and historical collections. I kind of have three important ones that we want to kind of work through today, but we'll do some exercises and activities together as a group. So I'll be monitoring chat for those. I'm going to try to play some audio. Fingers crossed that that works because sometimes these don't always kind of work out correctly when we try to share them over various technologies. So without further ado, let's go ahead and kind of jump into the materials that we have at public libraries. One note, you'll see a lot of different collections that our public libraries have available to them. When you get a copy of these slides later on, you can actually go review them. Here is an example of one of our collections. This is from the Courtney Hodges collection, which comes from the Houston County Public Library system. These are scattered throughout, and they're really great collections you can go take a look at and view at your own leisure. So when we talk about collections in our public libraries, they sort of fit into what I've kind of come to sort of three different kind of categories. A number of our libraries really have very kind of large and sort of locally focused genealogical and family history collections. These can kind of vary widely from family trees, but oftentimes they have documents documenting obituaries, family births, other forms of recognition of death from death certificates, as well as other kind of materials. Recently, I was visiting a library and I saw a family cookbook in the genealogy collection. So while sometimes we might not always think of genealogy collections as being sort of interesting to people who aren't doing genealogical research, I would maybe counter that they're oftentimes hidden gems and things that could be more useful, especially as work is done to make those collections more accessible, more descriptive work, so we can try to find those sort of hidden gems that are in those sort of family history collections. Uh, off, Most of our libraries do also have some sort of local history collection. Now, this can be a vertical file collection, but those vertical files would typically be newspaper articles, other things like that, major events, sometimes a little quicker for doing research than maybe a traditional newspaper, whether it be on microfilm or through the Georgia Historic Newspaper Project or some other online database of newspapers. Vertical files are really sort of interesting and may contain other materials such as brochures, pamphlets, discussions of events, so event handouts, event flyers, other things like that that might be really interesting to help have these kind of conversations about what is history, how can we read specific items, how can we read specific records, how can we understand them, what were the intents behind the creation of these different items, and kind of how they can relate and engage with different types of communities around different forms of literacy. Many of our local libraries have actually local collections. These can range from uh, individual papers to diary collections to collections of businesses. For instance, in our library in Brunswick, there's a really great collection related to paper mills that were in the Brunswick area. And so Georgia Pacific has actually partnered with them a little bit to kind of make sure that collection is in better shape, adding more materials to it, et cetera. So we have a really big documentation of a really important business to Georgia and its sort of economic development. Of course, some of our collections have ephemera in it, and these can range from all over the place to I have seen doll houses, I have seen other items, the trophies, plaques, but kind of along the sort of side of sort of that ephemera, there's oftentimes other collections such as city directories, school yearbooks, different types of items that could have different types of uses and different ways that you could potentially teach from them. Of course, our libraries also have sort of cultural collections that may be collecting community groups or groups that sort of engaged with advocacy or boosterism or some other kind of engagement within that community that maybe don't necessarily document specific historical events, but may sort of document how the community perceives itself, how it works with itself, and how people interact with one another. And then, of course, many of them have other. I throw out the codex again in Brunswick because it's on the forefront of my mind. This is a sort of a medieval period liturgical text that quite doesn't fit into any sort of collecting about the region, but is sort of an interesting item and an interesting resource that people can take a look at as well. So these are the types of collections we have in our public libraries. And soon enough, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, as soon as we get our press release and other announcements and a few other URLs worked out, we'll be announcing how everybody can find these collections. One of the things we've been working on at GPLS and in my department is on a statewide finding aid system for all our public libraries. Now, not every public library that has collections will be online on day one, but we've been working with many of our library system partners. We're up to about 13 right now to start including materials, helping them create finding aids, helping them work through and think about how to present themselves in archive space, as well as teaching them how to do and use archive space to its full potential. So look for that soon, look for an announcement soon, but this will be a really great way. You'll be able to find materials in public libraries, especially if you're in an academic institution and you want to partner with one of your public libraries on doing some kind of teaching and learning activity. It would be a really great resource to find. And we'll, of course, doing some experimenting on linking the records we have in the DLG with our archive space so everything can be cross-searchable so you can find all materials as easily and as efficiently as possible. Now, in terms of kind of who has materials, right now, as best as I can determine from the data that's available to us, is around 50 to 60% of our public libraries in the state have some sort of special collections. And so my kind of rough map here sort of gives some rudimentary locations of where some of these special collections are located. As you can see, they document our entire state. So we have some kind of special collections that will document coastal Georgia. We'll have some kind of special collections that document Northwest Georgia, Northeast Georgia, Atlanta, Central Georgia, you name it, there is probably a public library that has a collection that documents a community somewhere around the state that could be interesting for a student, a person who is doing, education in retirement, or anybody to take a look at. But our entire state is essentially covered by our public libraries, and they're a really great place to take a look at some interesting materials, or also have conversations with the community about their local history. In terms of materials that are available that are digitized, also in terms of kind of mapping, these kind of cover our entire state. A few little gaps kind of in south, sort of eastern Georgia, sort of between Macon and the coast. But of course, we're always working to kind of fill in some of these areas and fill in some of these geographic and cultural and community gaps, and whenever we're doing our digitization work with our public libraries. Right now, there are 123 digitized collections in the DLG that have been contributed by public libraries, whether they have created a project on their own. Many of our libraries have been conducting funeral program digitization projects. Principally, they've been targeting their African American communities and digitizing their funeral programs, kind of either with community help or community participation. Those have become a really important resource for doing kind of community cultural history, understanding kind of networks of people and who is sort of connected to who, specifically in communities like Augusta, Atlanta, and even a more recent one that's coming online, hopefully really soon. So this will actually be 124, is the Moultrie-Colquitt County area with funeral programs. This constitutes around 106,000, actually it's 107,000 items. And really those numbers, if we added in the pages, which you don't have a perfect count, would probably be quadruple or even more than that. So I say this basically say that there is a lot of content out there that could be really interesting, and especially if you want to target specific localities, to have them to have conversations and teach them different ways of reading, different ways of understanding materials. You can find something that would appeal to somebody. They're, ever present, even if it might not be their exact home county, you might could find something from 2 counties over, or something that might connect to them because of a relative who grew up in a specific county or had a specific connection to a specific part of the state. All kinds of different things, including many variety of topics of materials. I mentioned our African American funeral programs, but we also have city directories. We also have materials from, for example, from around, excuse me, my brain just died on me there, around Carrollton, where we have the records that document the births, live births that were taking place at home in the communities around Carrollton, Georgia. We have records that document various sort of like tragedies, such as tornado incidences from around the state. Postcards, all kinds of different sort of items and different types of materials that could engage with different types of users in different types of ways. If they need something to think about, if they want something to think about, or if you just want a tool to use in teaching a specific form of literacy, there's probably something you can find that would be really important and really useful to a specific community or a specific kind of locale. Now, one other thing I think to kind of address too is that public has specific types of interest in specific types of collections. And while some of the collections we may want to use for kind of purposes might not be the ones that are high use, we can kind of take what the public seems to be most interested in and maybe start making some plans and some thoughts around where could we sneak in and use the collections they're most interested in to introduce them to new collections for different types of literacy activities, or lead with the collections they're interested in and then introduce other things kind of along the way. So I'm a numbers person. In terms of collection usage for public libraries, year to date, we're over 500,000 users of just the public library collection material, and this is public library collection material in the DLG. So we can say people are really interested in this materials. Now, I can't say for certain they're all in the state of Georgia. I don't have the data that is that particularly granular, but I can say they enjoy this, they like to look at this, they are interested in certain types of materials. We can say that they're, out of those kind of total users, Many of them spent more than one session on the materials in the DLG, and also most of them looked at those materials more than once. At least per users, like a 1.5 times. So they're engaging with them, they're looking at them, they're interacting with them. In terms of what we've sort of noticed or most interested in, and sorry, this is overrunning a little bit, I can kind of fix that in a moment. One thing that's our most used collection are actually yearbooks from Middle Georgia, followed up by a collection of documents on Southeast Native American history, and then obituaries, funeral programs, a collection that sort of documents the city of Atlanta, funeral programs from Augusta, funeral programs, photographs, city directories, and then I'm going to scroll out of this so we can actually see everything. Pictures. So in our top 10, we kind of have a variety of different types of collections. We can definitely say that if I were in a public library and thinking about programming and thinking about how to talk about different approaches of literacy, probably I'm going to focus more on the groups that might be interested in genealogy. At least this is kind of what the data is sort of roughly telling me. Some others might have some different perspectives. But you can see that maybe a project talking about literacy related to funeral programs and kind of discussing a funeral program as an item to understand and to engage with and to teach people how to read might be super useful. We can also see other sort of documents that are popping up, such as a collection of Native American documents, of course, photographs, which are super helpful teaching people how to do sort of visual literacy, and then as well as working with postcards, which are also, I think, super interesting and engaging. In addition to that, at least anecdotally, we can kind of, I've seen a little bit of tracking between engagement with online materials and public programming at specific libraries. Now, over the next year, I'm going to be thinking about getting a lot more granular data on actual engagement post-programming. That's going to be a big push, I'm pretty sure, and a big pull to try to find the best way to do that data for everybody. But super anecdotally, we can look at, for instance, the Athens city directory uses, specifically the history room, heritage room at the Athens Clarke County Library does a lot of genealogy programs. And you can kind of see as they're doing their genealogy programs, more and more users are engaging with that specific record. So I say this now is like, as we're thinking about programming, as we're thinking about talking about different forms of literacy, not only do our approaches and thoughts about having our patrons, our users be historically literate, help them, but it also helps us and helps to drive usage. And so I think this kind of can represent, once we sort of start teaching our various user bases, our various people who we can potentially engage with, how to use these materials, that we're actually going to see more and more usage. And they can kind of drive us to think about the collections that are going to be most important to our users. So, quick intro to kind of some of the public library materials and sort of some thoughts around why we need to kind of spend a little bit extra time on it. Now I want to kind of go into sort of the specific areas of literacy. And this is, again, not extant. This is not everything you can think of when you're thinking about literacy in kind of historic materials or special collections. Whatever terminology you like to use, special collections seems to be easier than saying historical, genealogical, cultural, and other collections that might be in public libraries. But these are sort of the three that I kind of want to spend a little bit of time on. So first and foremost, sort of traditional information literacy. Then I think it's really important to talk about media literacy as it plays into certain types of materials, because a lot of, at least historical materials, kind of have this approach to either be understood as a media object, especially ones most people I think are interested in, such as newspapers, city directories, things like that. And then also artefactual literacy. Now, this one might be newer to some, but many of you may have this kind of understanding of kind of what we're talking about artefactual literacy, but we'll spend a couple of moments on that. So I am a definitions person. So whenever I'm talking about anything, I always want to start with a baseline definition of what we mean when we're talking about a specific subject. So I hate to kind of read out a definition, but this is sort of the rough definition going from, specifically, I'm pulling most of my definitions from the SAA dictionary, because I'm an archivist, and so I go to the SAA dictionary first. But this idea that when we're talking about certain forms of literacy, especially sort of research literacy, we want to teach our users how to find the specific sources that they're looking for. We want to see, can they talk about the problems, or can they evaluate these sources specifically as they're working through them for their whatever their research needs, whether it be pure personal edification, whether it be for a school project, whether it be for genealogical research, or whether it be for some other kind of activity that they need specific historical information for. And so when I think about his information literacy in kind of specific exercises that we can do when we're working with historical materials, I kind of think of it sort of in three ways. First and foremost is sort of teaching what is sort of known as traditional kind of archival research methods, which is where you explain kind of how people can go about using archival materials or special collections materials, whether they are digitized, whether they're in a library and you have to look through, say, a finding aid system, or something along that lines. This is sort of like the kind of traditional approach to teaching people how to do that kind of research method. To me, it's classic. We always have to do it with specific students, at least at the first time around, but when they've come into it, oftentimes you can do this kind of at a reference interview if you've got someone coming in to look at a special collections. Pretty standard. There's also, of course, I think the other kind of activity, which is explaining kind of how archives and special collections are different, and that oftentimes the policies and procedures for accessing those can be a little bit different. This would be where we would want to have our conversations with our users about, okay, why can't you see everything you want to see all at once? Why are there some use restrictions or access restrictions on it? What's the reason for this? And this also can get us into the point where we're sort of thinking about explaining that archival materials, special collections materials, oftentimes have a lot of weird reuse kind of issues attached to it. And kind of explaining sort of things like copyright, privacy, some of those really rudimentary issues for users. I think really kind of complex things, but in many respects, this is sort of how you have to set up a little bit, I think, for research for using historical records. Now, one of my favorite exercises, of course, is to do forms of primary source analysis. And there are many different tools out there that have been created from everyone from NARA to the Library of Congress. I was actually trying to find my old primary source analysis tool over the last couple of weeks, and I couldn't find it. I think it's stored on a hard drive somewhere. But the idea is that if we were saying going back to our concept of information literacy, where we really want to talk about this idea of evaluation and using sources, where we can start helping our users to be able to really understand them. And I found that these tools are useful for anyone of any age to just get them thinking about using a sort of tool. Personally, I've always done the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how is sort of an initial guide to doing analysis. So the who is who made it, the what is it that we're looking at, the where was it made, or is there something along that line. The how is, of course, how is it made? Is there some other processes? And then when is, of course, time period. And also part of that conversation is sort of, is there a specific intent behind this particular item? Getting them to think about those biases and other types of kind of information that they may find in their materials. So for our first little activity for the afternoon, we are actually going to utilize this tool right here. And sorry, it is... Let me pop this over to another screen so we can pull up our link, and then we're going to listen to a specific recording. And if we need to listen to it more than once, we can do that as well. And so one moment here, and I'm going to share you the link to our document in just a moment, as I am waiting for things to load in. Second, I'm going to mute this. Okay, we have our recording up. And apologies on this other little login issue that has decided to pull itself up right in the middle of me speaking. Love Google taking its time. So let me go ahead and have everybody begin listening, hopefully to the audio portion. And then I will show you the analysis tool. There we go. Copy link. So here you have a link to the document we're taking a look at. And then I will actually show our analysis tool here since I finally got it to pull up. But you can see this is a really interesting one from the Library of Congress. You can sort of see what are the types, what is the title? What do you think you will hear? Sort of a pre-recorded pre-thinking, then thinking about what are the different types of sound recordings. In this case, this one actually applies because we were listening to, well, you'll find out in a second, but it does work out. You could always take this model and add it to reflect whatever the collections you have in your institution or you might have students working with. You can ask yourself what people, you can summarize it. And so as we're listening to this recording, what I would like for the group to answer, and if you'll answer in chat for me, is what type of sound recording are you hearing? Can you tell if it was pre-recorded or if it was live? Think about the people and the topics that you're hearing, and then maybe briefly think about, the purpose and the reasoning behind the specific recording. So I'm giving you a little insight here, and if the sound comes through, so please let me know. This is actually from the Andrew Young collection at Auburn Avenue Research Library. They will be coming out hopefully in the near future, specifically online through the DLG. So I have a short clip here that we'll take a listen to. And please let me know if you can hear it.
Got no audio.
I think there is one little setting. And of course, yeah, you can sometimes do this in other sharing things, but I have. So I'm going to go off camera for a moment so I can get you a little closer to the sound. And we will begin with the audio shortly.
One. This is Mayor Andrew Young. Elaine Valentine believes in our city and its future. Punch 46 and let Elaine Valentine continue to work for you and for a greater Atlanta. Is that, she say Valentine or Valentine?
She says Valentine.
Mm. Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This is Mayor Andrew Young. Elaine Valentine believes in our city and its future. Punch 46 and let Elaine Valentine continue to work for you and for a greater Atlanta.
Alrighty, thank you for bearing with me. So let's go back to kind of our questions related to our analysis. What kind of recording was that? What was going on in that? Pre-recorded? It's definitely a pre-recorded ad of some kind. Who is involved with this one? So what are kind of our two parties if we were talking about maybe subjects that are individuals? Call to vote to action, so it's an attempt to get somebody to vote for somebody else. The mayor speaking. It's someone else who I'm not sure who the other voice on the line is. And speaking about specifically another candidate, and we would need to maybe go in and do some research on who is Elaine Valentine, who is she, what position is she running for, presumably somewhere in the city of Atlanta, things like that. Other thoughts? One of the things I wanted to kind of think about as we were looking through a couple of examples was, well, if we were doing a sound recording more focused on information literacy, how might we use the side of sound recording in a conversation with students, with adults, with other people who were using it? What would we want to emphasize about a recording like this? I know that's a big kind of question. Like, how might we think about this recording as a tool to teach with? Formal versus informal speech, really great. Thank you. What about potential kind of biases in speech? Because specifically, we've already said this is like a call reaction. It's an ad. Also, it points out that he's not sure the correct pronunciation of the name. That is really great. I'm kind of glad everybody's catching up on. I'm not sure how to say this name specifically, as that person would say it too as well, which is kind of interesting. But we can also have conversations about how campaigning works, how kind of the political process works, both at a local level, at a nation, in different types of levels as well, as might be something kind of interesting. Any other kind of final thoughts before we jump into two more activities, and then we'll have some time for questions? No more audio recordings this time. I only made myself have one challenging bit for today. All right, not hearing any final thoughts. We will go over and then move into media literacy. And so one of the reasons I want to talk about media literacy is I think personally that archival and historical collections are really ripe for having conversations about not only what was created and why it was created, but also them being inspirational points for different forms of interaction. I think oftentimes when we think of historical collections, we think of pretty standardized forms of research, traditional historical research, maybe even genealogical research. But I think there is, a lot of opportunity to take a look at different forms of media, even if it's textual media, and use that as kind of inspiration for having conversations of how individuals can relate to the past, and how we can take the past and use it sort of as inspiration for what we're doing today as well. And so when we think about media literacy, is this idea is we teach people how to evaluate, but also the idea of creating media. And I think that's really important to think about, specifically resources in public libraries, how they can be used to help their communities create different forms of media, whether it be art, whether it be photography, whether it be kind of anything like that. I think it's a really great opportunity. When we think about doing different types of exercises, I think, of course, you can talk about specific analysis, such as painting, political cartoons, advertisements. I found in kind of past life working in a university archives that advertising and political cartoons were often really something that engaged students. Advertising in particular, I think, really engaged students a lot. But I do think also paintings, historical paintings, if you have some in your collection, are really kind of useful when you think about why did someone sit for a portrait? What is the style of the portrait? What is the portrait trying to tell us about this person? And then kind of connect that with that person's life and times and the various things they did, whether they were good or not so good. I also think that creating media based on historical collections is really useful, and I'll show you some examples of some work that I've seen done with that. And then another thing that I think is vitally important to kind of engage with any level of the community is this idea of curating exhibits. So creating exhibits, but also capturing information, whether it be through oral histories or having conversations around scan days. These are exercises you can go in where you can teach people a variety of different formats and different approaches. So one kind of really neat example that I got to work with a number of years ago when I was at Georgia College, and has sort of been one thing that I have had dramatic inspiration from since then, is I worked with an art professor on two separate projects for students. One group was a fiber arts class, and what they essentially did is utilized the institutional yearbooks to find things that they wanted to make as a fiber arts project. And so a couple of our fiber arts students made sort of a 1940s inspired dress, and then another student made kind of a fiber arts piece based off of a competition that happened on campus called Golden Slipper. So they have a poem that was in there that was written by a former student. They sort of embroidered that poem, as well as did a sort of 2D, 3D kind of art piece based off that. To me, this is sort of helping a student engage with something that they are interested in, but also sort of having them to give themselves a moment to reflect on the past. Another example that I thought was super fascinating was students took some historical data and then basically constructed 3D cardboard items on that historic media. In this case, what we did is we allowed the students to set up, curate kind of their own exhibit in the reading room and left up some of the materials for some period of time, but essentially just giving someone access to resources and then encouraging them to think about, what does this original represent? And then how can you take this and modify it into something new and different and use it as your own inspiration for creating your own form of media. Another example of one that another one at Georgia College that I thought was really fascinating that went kind of way beyond what I was expecting was a project we called Citizen Soldier. And so we worked with a couple of freshmen kind of first semester kind of courses on doing oral histories with local or veterans they had some connection to, and also worked with an artist who painted veterans using shoe polish, because this artist had this sort of nonprofit that would help returning veterans reintegrate into communities by giving them positions at their business and helping them kind of reestablish themselves, as also helping them work through any kind of issues related to PTSD, et cetera, through their process. So students interviewed veterans, took a photograph of them, gave that photograph to the artist. The artist painted pictures of them. One is sort of in a meditative state. One is sort of in their sort of military in service state. And then the students came together along with the artist and we curated an exhibit. A lot of moving parts, a lot of different things, but actually allowed the students to learn about what exhibit creation is, learned about different forms of what media represents, what does an oral history represent, what are sort of the complexities of creating an oral history. Also, what is sort of the complexities of creating art around a person and a person's personal experience. And then also formalizing kind of the presentation of that art, the presentation of the oral history experience. And so it creates an opportunity to give a student or a person or community, you can do this with any age group, I really feel, a sense of ownership, but then also having them think deeper about something. If you like pedagogical lingo, you could call this project-based learning, where you could go in and deeply think about a project and kind of work through different forms of conversations around different forms of literacy as the students are working through that. So a couple of examples there to show you that. Last up, I do want to talk at least briefly about artifactual literacy, and then I will be polling everyone again with one final kind of example. Artifactual literacy is a concept that was created by Elizabeth Yakel and I should have had quoted the title of the article here for everybody, but in an article about reference work in archives, but this idea that when we have people coming into special collections and archives, we are trying to teach them some of that contextual relationship of what a primary source is and how it relates to other materials in a collection, and also kind of having an understanding of taking into the characteristics of that as a physical item and some of the sort of nuances of that particular item. This is where we're sort of really kind of getting at like a reel-to-reel recording is dramatically different than a digital recording, and explaining some of the nuances of a reel-to-reel recording. Like even in the time that would have been created, there might have been breaks, there could have been splicing, there could have been all kinds of different things that could have happened to a reel-to-reel recording. So a couple of examples of exercises, and then I will have one kind of final record, and then we'll open things up for hopefully a few minutes of questions. Is talking about the historical context of a specific record, maybe explaining the process of that record. And then, of course, I put context again, because I think explaining the context is vitally important of that record as well. So I'm going to present you with an item. There's one piece of text I have to tell you because the version of it I had was pretty blurry, but I will give you the text in it. And then we will kind of walk through asking questions about, so what is this thing? What do we think it is? What do we think the original context is? What's the process or the process use that was created for this? I know you might know this, you might be able to recognize this. Some people may be familiar with some of these items, or this might be completely new to you. So our example here is this item right here on the right. The text that you cannot see says, "Do you think teachers are necessary?" So I'll open it up with my question. What do we think this is? I think political cartoons are a really good example. Anybody else agree or disagree? Okay, we've got some agreements here. Yearbook art, could be yearbook art. I think that's really great. Could it be newspaper art? Could it be magazine art? Could be a college comic strip. If it's college, or I mean, I think we could probably agree that it's sort of a political conversation around is a strange black background. I think that's a really great observation. So let's put a pin maybe in college comic strip, and we can maybe come back to the meaning of it. Let's go back to the black background. How do we think this was created? And don't feel like you have to feel bad if you don't know, because it is a very specific process. But it does relate specifically to the black background. It is a type of kind of engraving. It's a lino cut. Good guess, Charlotte. So it's a linoleum block that has been carved out specifically with kind of reliefs. It's sort of a cheaper way of doing drawings for printing, but it is actually a linoleum or a lino cut block for this particular cartoon, with of course text put in afterwards from the printing process. So we've started understanding kind of what the media is. It's a lino cut, so we kind of can work into and talk about the sort of process of how you have to carve it out, and whether you can do a positive sort of a negative version of it, and then how the printing process is, and how kind of as that lino gets used, it'll sort of change, and sort of the process changes. You kind of wears away a little bit if you do too many printings from it. So kind of back to the context. So we think school, college. What do we think the creator is trying to get across specifically with this image, and kind of understanding kind of the snark or in kind of intent they have here? Too much work being put on students, I agree. You know, if we see our figure on the right, they are carrying a large stack of very big books, all the work being done outside the classroom, and wondering whether or not they even need to deal with the teachers themselves. Any guesses on the creator of this? Now, this is just for fun at this point. And there's actually something that tells you who the creator is. Yes, it's not a fraternity or sorority. Far from it. Brazos is very close. Yes, is Mary Flannery O'Connor. So this is Flannery O'Connor in her days as the cartoonist for the Colonnade newspaper at what would have been Georgia State College for Women. She did all of the lino blocks herself, did the text, and did weekly items for the newspaper for most of her time there from 1942 to 1945 as a student. So this is actually Flannery O'Connor's early work, and it's kind of fun stuff to look at when we think about from a media standpoint, and then also a connection to the author who eventually became Flannery O'Connor. So with that, with a couple of exercises, I wanted to move on to the question portion. So does anybody have any questions or any comments you want to bring up first and foremost? And I hope the exercises are kind of good to help us just spark some ideas and think about some materials and to look at some different types of resources you might want to take a look at. I know I kind of fudged with using an O'Connor image, but I have one. So I thought it would be a fun one for the afternoon. So any questions? So we have one question that's a really great question. So the question is, in Georgia, are historical societies connected to libraries, embedded in libraries, or a mix of partnerships? The easiest answer is it is mixed, and it is kind of all over the place. Some of our historical societies have direct connections, and some even have spaces in the library and direct relationships with the libraries. Some of them are outside partners and will partner on different projects with our libraries, and all partnerships kind of work great. There is another question in the chat about deep linking and mark records. I'm always sort of a favor of as many places as we can put material for users to find, the better. It's just finding the best way to do it depending upon the tool that's available for us. And that's one reason we went with archive space for some of our the public library collections that don't quite fit perfectly in the Pines catalog, is because they make a little more sense there, and hopefully will be a little bit more discoverable and I think easier for us to implement as well. So that's a really great idea, but of course, always wanting to do any kind of deep linking. Other questions or comments? Anybody have any ideas or things you want to share that you've worked on that have been really great when we talk about historical records, specifically thinking about them for activities around literacy or encouraging people to think kind of beyond just their sort of initial research needs to kind of gain a deeper understanding for a record? All right, well, I'm not hearing any more questions. Nicole, I believe we've probably come to the end of it. So if we want to stop the recording.